We are coming now to the first presentation, which is addressing the European wood market. And the presentation will be by Mr. Rupert Oliver, who is the lead author on hardwoods for the annual market review and leads Forest Industries Intelligence Lieutenant at UK-based consultancy in forest industry market intelligence and trade analysis. Mr. Oliver has over 20 years experience working in the international timber trade and industry. He is regularly consulted by international and national agencies on timber market developments. So, Mr. Oliver, please take the floor for your presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for that introduction. Everyone can hear me okay? Yes, this was an extraordinarily challenging presentation to put together, an overview of the European wood market. As you gather, I'm a specialist mainly in hardwood markets, so I'm having to talk about softwood markets, panel products markets. I'm explicitly not going to talk about pulp and paper markets because I gather there's going to be a session on that tomorrow. Also, I won't be talking in detail about biomass markets. However, this is what I will be talking about. I'll start off by looking at Europe in relation to other regions, just to set the context a bit. I'll talk about economic conditions and activity in the principal end-use sectors, which really highlights that activity looks pretty flat across the board, but there was a lot of things going on underneath that. I will talk briefly about each of the material sectors, softwood, hardwood, and panel products. But then I want to talk about future prospects, opportunities. Europe is very much an innovator in wood products, in policy developments, and actually there are a lot of opportunities evolving out of that. Then I want to talk briefly about some of the policy issues, both trade and environment. First, just to set things in context, this is the official data, I think, from UNECE on industrial roundwood removals by global region. Europe is second to North America. Removals have been rising over the last few years, approaching close to 400 million meters cubed, but still a long way down from North America, but significantly higher than other regions of the world. This is a bit of a cheat, this graph. It shows the US dollar value of imports of all products containing wood fiber. And on this basis, Europe looks pretty important. There's a lot more inter-country trade within Europe than anywhere else in the world. So it looks a very important region in terms of international trade. Of course, it is a little bit of a cheat because there's a lot of trade between relatively small countries in Europe, but the level of trade within Europe, I think, does emphasize the value of the free market in wood products, something which someone like me, who's British, should have conveyed more accurately to the populace. But unfortunately, we didn't manage to get that message across. The actual external trade with the EU is shown in the dotted line, which has been more flat in recent years. And now the EU, as a region, is the third largest importer after North America and the Chinese region. So it has declined. If we look in more detail at that data, looking more closely at EU trade in wood and wood furniture products with the rest of the world, some very interesting trends to identify there. This is coming at it from the perspective of the Europeans. This shows the import and exports of all those wood products in euro value with the rest of the world. And it shows there has been a very rapid increase in exports of euro value over the last 3 or 4 years. And imports have been more varied. Of course, it's a little bit, that's to some extent determined by changes in volatile currency rates. But at the same time, it does illustrate that the EU, from a euro perspective, has become quite a large net exporter of wood products. The 12 months to June this year, I think the net, the trade surplus was in the region of 3 billion euros in the 12 months to June this year. Very rapid rise, particularly in exports of furniture to the world, also in sawnwood and panels, whereas imports have remained reasonably flat over the long term. There has been, however, quite a large increase in imports of energy wood into the EU. Just to look at economic conditions and activity in key end-use sectors, I just want to rattle through this fairly quickly, starting with obviously looking at exchange rates. Exchange rates have been a key driver of trade trends over the last 4 or 5 years particularly, and the most noticeable trend over that period has been the remaining strength of the dollar and the relative weakness of European currencies relative to that, which has tended to undermine, obviously, the import trade and encourage the export trade to some extent. But also, the weak European currencies, they're only weak relative to the dollar. The CIS currencies are significantly weaker than the European currencies, with the effect that the European region has been importing significantly more from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus over the last 3 or 4 years. Looking at the key end-use sectors, construction, this shows the progress of construction activity over the last 3 years. The black line, I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a muddled chart, but the black line shows European EU 28 activity as a whole. It has risen slightly, but it's been pretty flat the last 6 months or so. And currently, activity in the construction sector in Europe is about 5% more than it was at the start of 2013, and it's still 5% lower than 2010 and 20% down on 2008. Some countries are doing a lot better than others. If you look at the Netherlands, it has been strengthening quite a lot. Spain, strengthening from a relatively low base. Other countries, though, Italy, particularly poor construction sector activity at the present time. France is also still sluggish on construction sector activity. This shows confidence. This is more of a leading indicator. It gives a bit of an idea of how things might develop in the future, and certainly construction sector confidence in the EU has been rising. However, I would point out that those figures, any figure under 0 means that people within the construction sector are still thinking that activity will decline within the next 3 months. So although things are improving, there's still not a lot of confidence in the European construction sector. Building permits, again, a bit of positive news. The last 6 months, we are seeing a rise in building permits across the European Union, very strong in Germany. In fact, Germany has remained probably the most buoyant construction sector in Europe. Netherlands was rising until the end of last year. So again, an indication that things are improving in Europe, but only slowly. The furniture sector, key market for panel products, for veneers, for hardwood timbers and softwoods to some extent. Again, there has been some recovery in furniture activity in Europe over the last 3 years. It did reach the bottom in 2013, and things have been improving. Imports are also increasing. But one of the important things to point out about Europe, which often surprises people when you're talking to them in North America, where they do import a lot of furniture into North America. In Europe, it's a very different situation. Last year, still 84% of wood furniture consumed in the European market was produced in the European market. In fact, imports are rising, but not at any great rate of knots. Window supply has remained flat over the last 3 years. Again, you would have thought that this would increase with construction sector activity going up, but I think the fact that this remains flat is an indication of the high degree of competition in this sector from other materials, particularly plastics. The door supply situation, again, wood doors, a slightly more progressive increase there in wood door supply. Very little is imported, most of it is produced in the European market. So again, this is a positive trend. At least we're seeing some increase in door manufacture in Europe. And we are seeing in Europe rising wood flooring production and consumption. Certainly, and a lot more of this is now coming from, well, slightly more of this is now coming from domestic producers. Imports, China, imports of wood flooring from China were rising quite significantly prior to the financial crisis, but they have since then flattened out. And actually, the domestic producers are now taking an increasing share of that particular market. This, I'm talking specifically here about real wood flooring and excluding those products which are laminated. Softwood. Softwood production is rising slowly within Europe. In fact, my estimate was it increased by only about 0.25% in 2015. Very minor increases. Again, we've seen some increases in Sweden and Finland, but again, this seems more or less in line with construction sector activity. We are seeing growth, but only a slow pace of growth, and there are constraints on increasing in supply of softwood. Sawn softwood consumption, again, up only very slightly in Europe last year, only about 1% last year. Again, though, we are seeing some quite interesting trades in the external sawn softwood industry. We're seeing rising imports from CIS countries in 2015, and that has been accelerating in the first half of 2016. Softwood exports were flat in 2015. Some of them were rising to Egypt, Algeria, and China. That trend has actually accelerated a bit this year. So we are seeing a rising level of exports of sawn softwood from Europe to other regions of the world. Yeah, this is quite an interesting chart. It does show the per capita sawn softwood consumption in Europe in 2015, obviously very variable. Very much higher per capita sawn softwood consumption as expected in the Scandinavian countries. And then there's a whole layer of countries, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Denmark, and Germany, where there's sort of moderate levels of consumption. And they're very long tail, with a lot of countries with very low per capita sawn softwood consumption. So there is significant growth potential to expand markets for sawn softwood, particularly in South and Eastern Europe, and certainly scope to expand in the traditional import markets in the UK, Netherlands, and France. And that's where a lot of the opportunity is to try and expand markets in those markets within Southern and Eastern Europe, and also in the UK and elsewhere. Sawn hardwood. This chart is interesting because it shows actually the use of species for fronting real wood flooring in the European market, and it does highlight one of the key issues in the hardwood market, in that there has been this incredible increase in domination of oak. In that particular sector, something like 60% of oak flooring flooring was produced in oak in 2008. Over the last 7 or 8 years, that's increased to about 80%. Other species, particularly beech, remain significantly underutilized. European production of sawn hardwood at the UNECE regional level, it did decrease 1.3% in 2015, and that was mainly due to a big decline recorded in Turkey. I'm not entirely clear on the reasons for that, but perhaps we could get a comment from Turkey on why that decline might have occurred. Production within the EU 28 group of countries did increase slightly last year by about 2.8% to 10.3 million meters cubed. And it's important to point out that much of that production is only in 5 member states in the EU: Romania, France, Croatia, Germany, and Latvia. Sawn hardwood imports, we have seen some increase in the EU in terms of the volume of sawn hardwood imports over the last 3 years. Those imports did hit bottom back in 2013. There has been a particularly large increase in imports in recent years from the CIS countries, from Russia and Belarus, mainly aspen and birch, and most particularly from Ukraine. And that was partly because of the log export ban that was imposed in Ukraine from November 2015, and certainly even before then we were seeing quite a big increase in oak and ash imports into the EU from Ukraine. There's also been a small and slow revival in tropical wood imports. They are regaining a bit of lost ground, particularly large increase in imports of tropical wood from Cameroon, and much of it destined for Belgium, which might be one effect of the EU timber regulation. It might be concentrating more of the tropical wood trade in the hands of a smaller number of larger importing companies within Belgium. Exports, yeah, some interesting trends on the export side. Sawn hardwood exports are increasing, notably, well, they were certainly increasing until this year into Egypt, China, Vietnam, and the USA. And in fact, exports in 2015 from the EU were significantly higher than imports, so 2.91 exports of sawn hardwood compared with imports of 2.78 million meters cubed, which a few years ago would have been unheard of, to think that we were exporting more hardwood as a region than we were importing. This year there's been a bit of a turnaround. Exports have declined mainly due to a slowdown in the Egypt market. Panel products. Yeah, I just wanted to talk, because the production of panel products, if you look over the last 5 years, has remained pretty flat. Obviously, much of the increase in European production of panel products occurred in the 1990s and the earlier years of the last decade. Since then, it has been quite flat. There's a lot of capacity, a lot of competition. Prices have been and margins have been very narrow in that sector. Competition from the variety of panel products that are available, and also from non-wood materials in various sectors. So this has encouraged quite a lot of innovation. There's just one example. I could have put numerous examples up there of how the panel products sector now is greatly improving the look and feel of the products, to the extent that even the FEP, the Wood Flooring Association, in their report this year, their annual report this year, said that many consumers now can't tell the difference between plastic, laminated products, and non-wood products, and the real thing. And this is really putting a lot of pressure on the real wood material, but of course is giving panel product producers quite an edge in the market. Just a few panel product issues that struck me from looking over the market reports. There has been a bit of investment, new capacity, particularly in Turkey during 2016 and 2017. I gather about over 1 million meters cubed of new installed capacity in Turkey this year. And also Turkish companies are now very active in investing in Russia and Romania. And we have seen a Chilean company, Arauco, entering the EU market this year for the first time with a joint venture with Sonai in Portugal. An interesting trend in laminate flooring. There has been some weakening in sales of laminate flooring in 2015, which is putting more raw MDF on the overall market. This is particularly, the reason for this is a little uncertain, but there does seem to be a lot of competitive pressure, particularly from these luxury vinyl tiles, particularly in Germany, the largest producing country. We are seeing continuing innovation in that sector. I put an example up there, modified fiber-based Medite Tricora Extreme Durable MDF for external use. Interesting to someone like me who's quite heavily involved in the hardwood sector to see a particle board, a panel product domestically produced in Europe that can potentially compete directly with tropical hardwood panel products. And VOCs still very much a live issue in that sector. The European Panel Federation has a project to encourage compulsory E1 standards that would require that all wood-based panels and derivative products placed on the EU market have an emission level no higher than E1. They're obviously trying to ensure that their market share is protected by ensuring high standards for low emissions, And that project was recently endorsed by the European Association of Furniture Manufacturers. This is what EPF had to say in their annual report of the future prospects for the industry. They're guardedly optimistic about the future, predicting stable to good outlooks in all markets. However, interesting in the context of the discussion this morning, the industry is greatly troubled by the increasingly critical status of wood availability as measured by its own research. And it does show in that map a lot of countries which it feels the wood supply into the panel product sector is critical. The whole of France and Italy and the whole of and Germany. Very significant issue for that sector. It struck me when looking at that map that it doesn't bear much, there's not a lot of correlation between that map and this map, which shows harvesting intensity as a percentage of increment over the period 2000 to 2010. Okay, it's a different period, but I think what that does highlight, there's large countries there, France, for example, Spain, which were identified as having critical shortages of wood fiber to the panel products industry. And yet, on that map, it illustrates that the level of increment is relatively low. So there are other obstacles other than simply the growth rate of the forests that are presenting obstacles to supply particles to the panel product industry. And that does emphasize, once again, the whole issue of increasing the need to increase wood mobilization. Talk about future opportunities very briefly. Am I running out of time? Probably. Well, there are new opportunities in construction. I think we've already seen how the opportunities within the EU market itself, the European market itself, are perhaps less than in some of the larger emerging markets, particularly China, Indonesia, for example, countries, India, countries where there is great potential to increase construction sector activity, where it is forecast to increase quite rapidly. And European producers, through their innovation, through their marketing skills, are beginning to export more to some of these markets. I've only got 3 minutes, so I'll rattle through these. I've already talked a little bit about EU exports to the rest of the world. This slide, you can have a look at it later on. It does show that over the last year or so, there's been a switch, and much of the increase in exports has been driven by not only North America, but the Middle East, Africa, and China in the last 3 years. One particularly important opportunity that has to be mentioned is the new opportunity in construction from cross-laminated timber. Something like 90% of cross-laminated timber production is in Europe. A figure of about 700,000 cubic meters of CLT was produced, is estimated, in Europe in 2015. I expect that figure will be closing in on 1 million meters cubed fairly soon. And we are seeing now increasing recognition of the potential for CLT, particularly in high-rise construction. A lot of construction in the emerging markets will be in high-density urban areas. So this is where there is real potential to expand share of wood products, particularly useful because a lot of the wood that's used for CLT is of lower grade. So this can actually provide an outlet for lower grade timber in high-value structural applications. Wood protection, briefly mentioned this as well. It's not a new subject, but there is this move now away from simply wood preservation to the whole idea of developing much more sophisticated approach to wood protection, combining new techniques to modify the wood itself, but also with high standards of assessment standards, high quality assurance standards, and also ensuring it's linked with modern design that encourages wood protection. And this, again, is an area that I think I certainly need to look at more closely. It is one of the areas where, if we're going to develop opportunities for wood protection, is one of the key areas for development. Policy issues. Have I got time to talk about policy issues? I've got a minute. Great. Brexit, question mark. I don't need to talk about that. You all know about that. Trade agreements, yes, there are 2 trade agreements on the table. Canada Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, due to be signed in October. The US Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, of which there is a projected negotiation at the moment. The underlying issue here is that if they were signed, it could encourage particularly greater transatlantic trade in value-added forest products. We have the whole issue of FLEGT and EUTR. I'll just mention that the EUTR, there was a review of the first 2 years of operation of the EUTR. It does indicate that there was, although there has been uneven implementation, it is beginning to change trade attitudes, structures, and distribution networks. I can certainly answer more questions on that if you want more detail. The Paris Climate Change Agreement, absolutely critical for the wood industry. I think if you read the agreement and looked at it in any detail, it mentioned forestry numerous times. It was the only sector where there is clearly global recognition that cutting emissions from that sector and promoting sustainable forestry are efficient ways to address climate change. And of course, it may bring greater long-term commitment to greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. Finally, yes, the EU Renewable Energy Directive, we have a key issue for the wood product sector generally at the moment is the discussion that's ongoing about the sustainability criteria for biofuels to receive government support and be counted towards national targets. I understand the current standards indicate that, the draft standards indicate that food crops can contribute no more than 7% maximum to national carbon reduction targets. But there will be more credit for fuels that do not place additional demands on land. So wood biomass, except sawn and veneer logs, would be given additional credits within that standard. The other big requirement is that new biofuel plants must achieve a 60% greenhouse gas saving compared to fossil fuels. And then I must mention this, the EU Action Plan for Circular Economy, which actually makes great reading to anybody involved in the wood products sector. It's encouraging a very wide range of actions to promote eco-design based on repairability, durability and recyclability, energy efficiency and labelling. And putting a great deal of emphasis on waste, something that the wood industry has been very much involved in over many years. So a lot of opportunities there. Thank you very much. I've got a red ticket saying stop. Thank you.